The monkeys.
No, there's no monkeys in Revelation. Hey, we're the monkeys.
If you can find me a relevant song, Keith, I'll do it. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Welcome back to week 26 of our comparative study of Revelation. That makes this half a year that we've been working our way through the book. We are up to chapter 17 today, which means we have only a handful left. I can actually kind of convince myself that we might be done by the end of September. We'll see how it goes. Today, we are on the subject of Babylon, Babylon the Great. You recall that last week we had seen the final set of judgments poured out, right? The 7 bowl judgments of God's wrath poured out on the kingdom of the beast. And in the midst of that, we had a refrain. For the second time that we've seen this refrain, we saw a declaration that Babylon, Babylon the Great, was fallen. The thing is, that's all we know about Babylon the Great. We have had 2 separate occasions in Revelation to this point that there has been a declaration that Babylon has fallen. We haven't actually seen Babylon, at least not under that label. Well, today we're going to correct that. This week and next are all about Babylon the Great, the enigma, the mystery, Babylon. So with that in mind, let's begin in chapter 17. Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came to me and said, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality, and with the wine of whose sexual immorality the dwellers of the earth have become drunk." And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the impurities of her sexual immorality. And on her forehead was written a name of mystery: Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and the earth's abominations. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. When I saw her, I marveled greatly. But the angel said to me, "Why do you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns that carries her. The beast you saw was, is not, and is about to rise from the bottomless pit and go to destruction. And the dwellers on earth whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world will marvel to see the beast, because it was, and is not, and is to come. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. They are also 7 kings, 5 of whom have fallen. One is, the other is not yet come, and when he does come, he must remain only a little while. As for the beast that was and is not, it is an 8th, but it belongs to the 7, and it goes to destruction. And the 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received royal power, but they are to receive authority as kings for 1 hour together with the beast. They are of one mind, and they hand over their power and authority to the beast. They will make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those with him are called chosen and faithful. And the angel said to me, "The waters that you saw where the prostitute is seated are the peoples and multitudes and nations and languages. And the 10 horns that you saw, they and the beast will hate the prostitute. They will make her desolate and naked, and devour her flesh, and burn her up with fire. For God has put it into their hearts to carry out his purpose by being of one mind, and handing over their royal power to the beast, until the words of God are fulfilled. And the woman that you saw is the great city that has dominion over the kings of the earth." All right, so we have here Mystery Babylon the Great, right? Enigma Babylon, depending on your reading here. Thankfully, this is one of those chapters where John gives us some interpretation of the mystery, right? We are told very clearly that this is a sign, that this is a symbol, but we get part of the key to the symbol to get some idea of what's going on here, right? So we've got this picture. There's this woman standing here, or seated here more properly, seated on a beast. The beast itself is standing in a place of many rivers, many waters stretching out for it. The woman is richly adorned. She's beautiful to look at. John says partway through that he was amazed to look at her. Most commentators that I read said that amazed has this sense that even though John knows that this woman is evil, right, that she is tempting and corrupting the nations, that there's still something attractive about her, that it's hard not to be enthralled by this queenly demeanor that she's presenting here, right, as she sits upon the beast, decked out in purples and scarlets and gold and jewels. But going into this scene, John already knows, and we already know, the outcome. The outcome is that Babylon is fallen. We saw this all the way back in chapter 14. Another angel, a second, followed, saying, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, she who made all the nations drink the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality," right? We saw that back in chapter 14, and it kicked off this judgment cycle where it's described how God has taken those who are being judged and has thrown them into the winepress of his wrath to be trampled so that the wine flows out, right? This blood flows out like wine from the winepress of God's wrath. The description of Babylon, it will not surprise you to learn, is rich with allusion to the Old Testament. Now, we've seen one of these things already. The very phrase, Babylon the Great, appears in only one place in the Old Testament. Does anybody remember where in the Old Testament we said that phrase shows up? In Daniel. Good. In Daniel, specifically, as Nebuchadnezzar stands on his balcony and he looks out over the city and he thinks to himself, "Is this not Babylon the Great, which I have made, Babylon which I have built," right? And God judges Nebuchadnezzar in that moment and says, "You will walk on all fours, you will eat grass, you will have the mind of a beast because you have claimed this for yourself instead of recognizing where it has come from," right? And so in the very name, Babylon the Great, we have a couple of strong allusions that John's readers would catch. One of those, of course, is what is the function of Babylon in the Old Testament? What does Babylon do most notably? It judges Israel, right? Babylon judges Israel. It carries Israel off into captivity, right? And second, Babylon here is described as Babylon the Great, a name that inspires fear, yes, but that already contains within it allusion to its downfall, right? We should expect judgment to come here because that is a name associated with overweening pride and the judgment that follows. Do you see that? Okay, so first we see that. Second, we see the description of Babylon. Babylon is described as a harlot and the mother of harlots, right? And hear that, right? It is not merely that Babylon is herself unfaithful, it is that she teaches her children to practice the same. She is, in some sense, if Babylon is a city, she is inspiring the other cities of the nations to do likewise, right? She is teaching them to follow after her practices. She is the wellspring from which the harlotry of the nations comes. Unfaithfulness, infidelity, harlotry as applied to nations is an old metaphor. It is used throughout the Old Testament. Yeah, Jim. Yeah, please.
Early in the chapter, when we say there's a lot of that, sexual references, basically that is referring to false worship.
Right, good. Almost without exception in the Old Testament, if you see descriptions of harlotry applied not to individuals, but to nations, the idea is of a national unfaithfulness in worship, right? That your worship, right? Remember there's this metaphor all through the Old Testament that says that Israel is like we would say like the bride of Christ today in the New Testament. Of course, they don't phrase it that way in the Old Testament, but there's an idea of a marriage of Israel and God, right? That they are linked to each other, that Israel is like the wife, the spouse of God, but God describes Israel again and again as an unfaithful spouse who runs after other gods, right? That her infidelities are her chasing after the Baals and the other false gods. This is a metaphor that repeats itself over and over through the Old Testament. Where would we find that most prominently? Where can you think of that it would definitely show up as a metaphor in the Old Testament? Hosea, right? Hosea is purely built on this as a metaphor, where Hosea the prophet is actually told, take a wife, right, who's been a harlot, who will again be unfaithful to you, and love her and pursue her anyway, because in this way you are mirroring God's relation with Israel, right? That Israel runs away and is unfaithful and is sold into slavery, and God promises to go forth and to buy her back from that anyway, right? So there's this great promise given there, but the metaphor is exactly the same. And so when we hear that Babylon is the harlot, the mother of harlots, that's what we ought to be thinking of here, that this is not primarily, or at least on a first order, actual literal sexual immorality that's in view here. It is an idolatrous turning away, right? A false worship that may certainly incorporate sexual practices into it, right? Certainly much of the false worship of the first century would have, right? But that it is, as its first order sin, the wellspring from which everything else is springing, the wellspring is this false worship, this turning away and running after idols. We're going to come back to that theme on a couple of points here. But we see the language here show up in, or these kinds of descriptions show up in several different places in the Old Testament. For instance, in Proverbs, you may remember, does this contrast, right? It presents these two women to you. One woman is wisdom, right? Wisdom's calling you to reason with her. She's calling you to know and to understand. But there's also this other woman dressed as a prostitute. We're here in Proverbs chapter 7. Wily of heart, she's loud and wayward. Her feet do not stay at home. Now in the street, now in the market. At every corner she lies in wait. She seizes him and kisses him, and with bold face she says to him, I've spread my couch with coverings, with colored linens from Egyptian linen, for my husband's not at home, he's gone on a long journey. With seductive speech she persuades him, with her smooth talk she compels him. All at once he follows her, as an ox goes to the slaughter, or as a stag is caught fast till an arrow pierces its liver, as a bird rushes into its snare, he does not know it will cost him his life. Right? You can see the parallels here in this description of the, again, whether or not it's a literal seduction, it's a conceptual seduction of pulling this man away into foolishness, into ruin, right? That's the idea that's being warned against in Proverbs. It's the same kind of picture here. Again, we talked about Hosea a moment ago. Whoop, going the wrong way. Hosea chapter 1, right, gives us this same metaphor. I think we've talked about this already. There's a connection, I think, here between the idea of Babylon as false worship, as a false drawing away of the people here, and what we've already seen of the mark of the beast in earlier chapters. Remember that those who take the mark of the beast, the mark seems to fill several roles, however we want to understand it. One of those roles is economic, right? It is the thing that allows you to buy and sell. If you don't have the mark, you can't buy and sell. You can't participate in the economic life of the beast's kingdom. But another seems to be a mark of worship, right? Taking the mark is incompatible with presence in the book of life, right? It is incompatible with being a true follower of God here. Those who have the mark are in the group that's being judged. Those without the mark are not in these last few plagues. You with me there? And so there seems to be a linkage in these ideas that just as the mark was kind of a fusion of economic and spiritual spheres that led people astray, right? If you want to buy and sell, right? You want to be able to participate in the economy, you've got to pledge your allegiance to the beast to be a part of that. Something similar seems to be happening here. Babylon is a set of spiritual unfaithfulnesses, right? It is a system of spiritual unfaithfulness, but it is also one of wealth, right? One of privilege that invites people in to participate in that wealth that she has, right? In the luxury that she has. You look at that image, right? Over and again, gold, a goblet of gold that's full of filthy things, but that the outside looks attractive, right? It draws you in with that allure of wealth. And so there's a similar set of references, of symbols that are showing up here. Does that make sense? The other thing to note about Babylon's description is it is very close to a priestly description, right? A lot of the descriptions of the scarlet, the purple, the gold, the pearls, many of these words are used in the Septuagint to describe the vestments of an Israelite priest. And so Many commentators look at this and say, in some sense, Babylon is this fusion of economic and religious systems that are pulling away, that are trying to draw people away into the empire of the beast. Now, we see Babylon at first astride the beast, riding it, right, in a position of authority. That's not where she's going to stay, right? But at the start of the picture, the idea is that she's a little bit the one in charge here. She's the one drawing people in toward the beast before that turns round on her. Okay, I'm going to pause for breath real quick there. Anybody want to jump in? Thoughts, questions, anything so far? Everybody good? Okay, all right. Now, what can we say about her? Again, there's other parallels in this description that we've got. Look back, for instance, to Jeremiah 51. Flee, says Jeremiah, flee from the midst of Babylon. Let everyone save his life. Be not cut off in her punishment, for this is the time of the Lord's vengeance, the repayment he's rendering her. Now, pause for a moment. This is, of course, Jeremiah talking about, actual Babylon, right? In Jeremiah's day, as the people are being carried off, it is literal Babylon of his day that is primarily in view. That is, of course, not primarily in view in John's description in Revelation, or at least most readers would say this is not primarily about actual literal Babylon. And yet, I think John is borrowing from that language in the pages of Revelation as he writes here. Look at what comes next in Jeremiah. Babylon was a golden cup in the Lord's hands, making all the earth drunken. The nations drank her wine, therefore the nations went mad. Suddenly Babylon has fallen and been broken. Weep for her. Right? I think it's unmistakable that metaphor of the golden cup that maddens the nations, that makes them drunk and intoxicated with her delights. I think clearly that's in view again in Revelation 17 here. Likewise, in Isaiah chapter 23, Isaiah has a judgment on the city of Tyre, right? And says of Tyre, so Tyre is a mercantile city, right? Tyre is a city on the coast. They have a fleet. They trade with everyone. So again, there's that idea of economic participation in the system, right? What can we say of Tyre? In that day, Tyre will be forgotten for 70 years, like the days of one king. At the end of 70 years, it will happen to Tyre as in the song of the prostitute. Take a harp, go about the city, O forgotten prostitute. Make sweet melodies, sing many songs that you may be remembered. At the end of 70 years, the Lord will visit Tyre, and she will return to her wages and will prostitute herself with all the kingdoms of the world on the face of the earth. Now, a couple of things to note here of significance. One of these is that, again, in the case of Tyre, we have this sense of prostitution or of harlotry connected with this economic activity, right? So that's one of our reasons for saying this is not just religious unfaithfulness, but it is in some sense webbed together with these economic links with all the nations. Second, notice that Tyre is not Israel, right? I mean, let's make a bold claim there. Tyre and Israel are different, and so it is not just Israel that receives this description of being a prostitute, of being unfaithful. It is sometimes applied to unbelieving nations as well, and so we have to be careful not to say, well, Israel's always the harlot, and so it must be the harlot here as well. Does that make sense? Okay, so lots of Old Testament allusion here, lots of similar metaphor that's being drawn on. Again, one more out of Isaiah. Come down and sit in the dust, virgin daughter of Babylon. Sit on the ground without a throne, daughter of the Chaldeans. For you shall no more be called tender and delicate. Your nakedness shall be uncovered, and your disgrace shall be seen. I will take vengeance, and I will spare no one. Our Redeemer, the Lord of hosts is his name, is the Holy One of Israel. Sit in silence and go into darkness, O daughter of the Chaldeans, for you no more shall be called the mistress of kingdoms. But evil shall come upon you, which you will not know how to charm away. Disaster shall fall upon you, for which you will not be able to atone, and ruin shall come upon you suddenly, of which you know nothing. So again, a judgment on actual Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar Babylon, right? On the Neo-Babylonian Empire here. But again, the language, the promise of judgment, the promise of Babylon is here portrayed as a sorcerer, right? If you read the full chapter, I've skipped over this, but there's this idea of that Babylon is a sorceress who has all these magic charms that she uses to defend herself and to take control of the minds of whoever is around her. And there's a promise that all of that comes to nothing here, right? Again, an idea of a metaphor of Babylon as being unfaithful, as being in some sense a harlot here, comes through in Isaiah's language. All this, I think, is the background that John is drawing on, in some sense, to make the prophecy more sure. Now, I'm not saying he doesn't see and hear exactly what he's describing, but I think the vision he's giving is meant to draw back to that original language in Isaiah, in Jeremiah, and elsewhere, to say, just as Babylon of old was indeed judged, which seemed impossible at the time those were being written, right? Babylon seemed unstoppable when Isaiah is being written. Just as that Babylon was judged, so too this further fulfillment that John is writing about, that empire too will face judgment. There too, the promises of the Lamb ultimately stand secure. Does that make sense? Cool, but who is it, right? Like, if these are the attributes of Babylon, who is Babylon? Well, I'm not going to tell you yet. I got another slide first. One other contrast I want you to see, and that is that there are three different women portrayed across the course of Revelation. We have, back in chapter 12, a description of a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon and the stars about her head, who gives birth to the one who will rule the nations, who gives birth to Christ, and then is caught up into the wilderness to safety, right? She's pursued by the beast. The beast tries to kill that woman. She flies off into the wilderness and is safe. Here instead, John goes to the wilderness and he sees not the righteous woman who fled there then, but he sees this other woman not chased by the beast, but sitting on the beast, right? In league with the beast, who is morally the opposite of her in every way. Likewise, we have in the last few chapters the description of the bride of Christ, the new Jerusalem coming down stainless and pure. And here again in chapter 14, we have some pre-echoes of that, this description of the 144,000 sealed and standing on Mount Zion. Again, the purity, the faultlessness, the spotlessness of these 144,000 is emphasized, and emphasized at points in sexual terms. I think we should see these as similar descriptors, right? As saying that just as Babylon is unfaithful, that the bride is faithful, right? That there is a distinction between these two that's being made in the language, that the contrast is very direct and very intentional. Does that make sense? Okay, so John is setting this apart. This is just as the beast, we might say, is the mirror image, right? The broken, inferior copy of Christ that tries to copy his attributes and fails. Here we have something that tries to copy the attributes of the bride of Christ and is insufficient at that as well. Yes, I hear a voice. Angela. Yes. Okay, good question. Who are the 144,000? Thank you, Angela. Next question. So, what we've said of the 144,000 is this. You can read them at several levels of symbolic representation, right? At kind of their most literal representation. So let's take this in sort of the dispensationalist, some forms of premillennialism, right? That's going to be your most literal reading. This would say this is something like 144,000 actual people from the actual tribes of Israel, right? So today the only tribe that we have a lot of certainty as to where they are is, of course, the tribe of Judah, the Jews, right? With some bits of Benjamin and Levi and some of the others mixed in with them. But there are other tribes have been scattered to the nations, perhaps descendants of those tribes, right? People who are in some sense still descendants of the tribes of Israel are chosen out, are redeemed, this fulfillment of God's promises as described in Romans, that there will be a great coming back of Israel, right? That these are those who follow God, who come out of the Jewish faith, and of the church that is around at that time, whatever extent there is a church around at that time, they are specially marked out. Does that make sense? And so some of the promises are made to these Jewish Christians specifically. They're given a song that only they can sing, that they're unstained, that they are spared from some of the specific curses. We're told, don't touch the 144,000. Not that they are the only ones saved in this time of tumult, but that they are specially marked out as a final fulfillment of the promises of Israel, right? That's kind of your most literal reading. A step up from that would be that this is a symbolic representation of the church in the end times writ large, that John moves back and forth between a group that's 144,000 specifically and a group from all nations that's too many to number, and he's talking about the same group both times, and he's just kind of flipping the image around and showing it two different ways. But this is showing a massive people who do repent, who do come to Christ in this period, and that all these attributes, right, them following the Lamb, being spotless in his service, being protected, these are descriptions of the whole church of that period. Others would look at this and say this is the church through the ages. This is just a way of talking about the church. The church is those who follow the Lamb. And so, right, depending where you fall on that, you might read things like the description that they are all virgins in different ways, right? If you read that as these are literally 144,000 Jews, you might take that very literally. If you go a notch or two up that scale of symbolic interpretation, you might say this is in contrast with Babylon, right? They have not sullied themselves with Babylon, right? They are kept pure of running after other gods. They are kept pure of taking the mark of the beast, whatever that entails, right? They are pure and committed in their devotion to Christ, and that is separate from what the world is becoming around them. Does that make sense? That's several answers, Angela. You only asked for one, but pick your favorite from the list there. Does that answer what you're asking? Yeah, okay, good. Anybody else there?
Just that if you take that very first category and most literal from that verse in Revelation 14:34 on the board there, assumes or seems to say they're single gal, or single people,
And
not necessarily the not defiled part is what's.
yeah, I'll say I think reading this as, not defiled themselves with women for they are virgins, I think reading that as purely literal, I think that's, it sounds a little odd relative to the way that Scripture never talks about marriage in general as being defiling, right? And so for that reason, that it seems counter to the way the Scriptures all throughout talk about marriage, it seems weird for it now to be like,
Marriage bed is undefiled.
right. That to me suggests that this, at least this language, is not meant to be literal and sexual. It is meant to be referential to say, this is the holy army of God, right? Just as the holy army of God kept themselves, as the army of Israel kept themselves pure before a battle, and didn't go home to their wives, even where that would be appropriate. They kept themselves set apart prior to the battle. Here too we see, here is an army set apart, right? Kept pure, kept away from Babylon, we now see, right? That they have not participated with Babylon in whatever her evil worships are. That to me seems like the stronger reading, but that is not a universal interpretation, right?
And this army fights not with swords but with gospel.
Right. What do we see them doing? They stand on a mountain and they sing, right? That is their battle. And then they die a lot, right? Those are the two things they do. And the book tells us, hey, when they did that, they won. They overcame the beast. Good. Anybody else? Okay, all right. So, who is Babylon? Well, we get some clues. Thankfully, we got an angel here to give us some interpretation. What can we say? First, she is a city. that actually helps a lot, right? She is a city in particular. She is the great city that has dominion over the kings of the earth. Second, she is seated on a beast. The beast has 7 heads, and the 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. So we are looking for a city on 7 mountains. Third, she kills the saints, right? She is drunk on the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. Fourth, she is seated on many waters. Now again, this is a reference back to original Babylon. Old Babylon sits on the mouth of sits on the river Euphrates. We've seen the Euphrates several times in Revelation already, but there's an idea that Babylon is kind of at this network of tributaries that run under and beneath and around the city. She does literally sit on many waters. And you can picture for an empire having a river that runs right by the empire. That means you can feed yourself better, you've got fertile farmland, you have better travel because you can take boats up and down the river, and so you can move goods, right? You've got an economic hub that's connected to the river. Rivers are kind of the lifeblood. They're the interstate highways of your ancient empires. And so it made good sense that a city on many waters would be connected to everybody else. Well, here we are told that Babylon is metaphorically seated on many waters, that the many waters are the peoples and the multitudes and the nations and the languages. So she is connected to or ruling over, right? She is seated on top of them, these many peoples and multitudes and nations and languages. And so, if you're in the 1st century and you're looking for a city on 7 mountains that rules over all kinds of peoples and nations and languages, it's kind of a short list, right? Who is the most natural candidate to fill this role? It's Rome, right? Most commentators are going to read this and say, this is either actually Rome, or it is, can we say it is a Rome? That it is Rome as typological of a kind of empire through the ages that fills this role, right? You might say this is literal Rome, the literal Roman Empire on 7 hills, or you might say it is every empire that plays the role of Rome, right? Every empire that rules over the world, that sets its stamp on all the nations around it, right? That has a dominance over everyone else. We might say, if that's an echoing idea, Rome is the typology of it. Rome is the pattern that all these other empires follow. Most commentators are going to take that reading. However, I want to at least touch on an alternative, and that is that for our post-millennial interpreters, for our preterist interpreters, or again, remember, postmillennialism sees this as connected very strongly with judgment on Israel, right? That's going to be always the emphasis of the postmillennial reading, is that Revelation is God's letter of divorce to national Israel because of their killing of the Messiah, yeah? In a postmillennial reading, some postmillennial commentators read this still as a description of Jerusalem. Well, why? Well, because Jerusalem is described in some of the similar language to what we see here. We're told that Babylon here has drunk the blood of saints and prophets, right? Similar language, we've said this before, similar language is used by Christ in his description of Jerusalem. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that stones the prophets, right? The idea that Jerusalem is where the prophets are killed even is echoed elsewhere in Revelation, right? Jerusalem is actually described as the great city where also our Lord was crucified, where there's an idea of it being a place stained with blood earlier in the book. Further, some commentators argue that Rome is not described as being on 7 mountains. That's not the normal way of talking about Rome. Rome is usually described as being on 7 hills. And if you're going to describe something as being on 7 mountains, well, it turns out Jerusalem is also kind of sitting on 7 hills or mountains, whichever label you want to use. Further, if Babylon is described with an idea of unfaithfulness, right? Her harlotry is her primary attribute. Well, to be unfaithful, the argument runs, you have to first have someone you're supposed to be faithful to. Rome's never had anybody she's supposed to be married to spiritually. Jerusalem has. And so the argument is that Jerusalem makes better sense as the fulfillment of this. This promise of judgment is the beast is Rome. The beast turns now on Jerusalem, right? That the beast and Jerusalem were allied together. The priests and the Romans worked together to kill Christ. Now the priests who had led astray and had relied on Rome as their muscle, now are betrayed by the Roman Empire and destroyed by it. So runs the argument. Again, Ezekiel chapter 16 speaks of a judgment on Israel that has a lot of parallels to the description of Babylon. I will gather your lovers, all those you loved and all those you hated. I will gather them against you from every side and uncover your nakedness to them. And I will judge you as women who commit adultery and shed blood are judged. That is absolutely the same language that's been described to Babylon, right? She is one who commits adultery and sheds blood. Here, that exact language is applied to Israel. I will give you into their hands, and they shall throw you down and break your lofty places. They shall strip off your clothes. They shall burn your houses. Babylon, too, in the judgment that the beast enacts on her, is described as having her finery torn away and of being burned and devoured by the beast. And so, again, it's hard not to think that John at least has this language in mind when he's writing here. And this, again, is applied unmistakably in Ezekiel to Israel. There's no question of the target of it there. So that's the argument. I think this is a little bit compelling, right? I think the parallels in Ezekiel are pretty close. But does Jerusalem rule over the kings of the earth? Because that seems a little bit of a stretch to me, right? It seems kind of hard to argue that the city of Jerusalem is the one in charge in the first century, whereas saying Rome rules over the kings of the earth feels a little bit more plausible, right? Likewise, is Jerusalem a city seated on many peoples and kingdoms and nations and languages? That feels like a difficult claim to make, and the preterist interpreters here can say, well, you know, there are synagogues everywhere. There are synagogues all throughout the Roman Empire. So, and I'm just not sure that adds up to saying that Jerusalem is ruling over, is seated over all these different nations and tribes. Does that make sense? And at that point, I think the metaphor breaks down and struggles a little bit. But I think this really does come back to kind of your interpretational key. Do you see Revelation as being primarily a judgment on Israel, or do you see it adapting even judgment that was once applied to Israel and now applying that language to Israel's enemies and promising judgment on them? Does that make sense? Which path you read Revelation as being primarily about is certainly going to shape what you think is going on with Babylon here. Good? Okay, all right. So we've said the woman seems to be linked to the economic and religious aspects of the beast's kingdom. And there's an idea here that for a time, the beast's kingdom benefits from that, right? That people are drawn into the kingdom by these economic, these religious aspects. And they share a common goal. Both the beast and the woman hate the saints, right? They both persecute and drink the blood of the saints here. Some have argued that the beast is described as scarlet at this point because it's been stained by the blood of the saints up to this stage. There's a common goal for a time, but that common goal breaks down. The woman rides the beast, but she is not the beast, right? She is separate from it in some way. And ultimately, there is going to be a division between these two. If she has left behind, if she's unfaithful to God, she will now be unfaithful to. That is not the right verbs there, but I hope you're getting the sense of it, right? The beast now is in some sense unfaithful to her. He will now turn on her. What can we say of the beast? Well, the beast, I think, is a little bit easier here. The beast, we are told, is a scarlet creature with 7 heads and with 10 horns. This is language we've seen before back in chapters 12 and 13. In chapter 12, we saw a great red dragon. That seems like a nice match, with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his head 7 diadems. That is, the 7 heads, also 7 kings. In chapter 13, we saw a beast rising out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads, and 10 diadems on its horns. That is, the 10 horns are 10 kings, and blasphemous names on its heads. A lot of the language here, right? Blasphemous names on the heads, blasphemous names on the heads. The heads, the horns, they match both ways. Now, we've been told who this figure is. Revelation 12 is real nice to us and says, the dragon is that serpent of old, the devil. Got that one, right? Nice and easy, no interpretation required. The beast being ridden here seems to have attributes of both of these figures, both the dragon itself and the beast to whom the dragon lends its power. Like the dragon, the beast that's described here in chapter 17, we are told, was and is not and is about to rise from the bottomless pit. Now, we have seen figures rising from the bottomless pit. Way back in chapter 9, there's a pit that's opened. The bottomless pit is opened, and smoke like the smoke of a furnace comes out. These demonic locust figures rise out of the pit, and we are told that the locusts have over them as a king the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name is Destroyer. Right? And so that seems then to be a spiritual figure. We're told it's the angel of the bottomless pit, right? That seems to be a linkage very clearly between the beast and the dragon, right? That the dragon is the one coming out of the bottomless pit. Likewise, in chapter 11, this figure is described as the beast that rises from the bottomless pit. By the way, real quick before we move on, the beast you saw was and is not and is about to rise. What does that language evoke in you? It was, it is not, it is about to. Yeah, that's right. It's a broken, partial mimicry of Revelation's repeated description of the Lamb and the one who sit on the throne. You know, holy is the Lord who was, who is to come. The beast tries to live up to that and can't, right? He was, he is not, he will be, and then he goes to destruction. Again, this idea of the beast from the sea is not, right? He was, but then he's given a mortal wound. He is not, and then he will be again, right? Similar language there. And so I think there's a combination of these two figures, that the beast that the woman sits on has the features both of the devil and of the empire, empowered by the devil. That they're both, their features show up in this set of descriptions here. She sits astride this devilish empire and for a time is the guiding figure in it. But remember that there's a repeated idea in Revelation, and that is if you are on Team Devil, you have a terrible enemy, and your terrible enemy is Team Devil, right? Shockingly, Satan does not turn out to be a good ally, right? He is not a good and trustworthy figure to have on your side over and over again, right? When the demonic locusts come out of the pit, the demonic locusts are bad guys. Who do they go after? Other bad guys, right? They can't sting those who have been marked by the Lamb. They sting and torment those who follow the beast, those who follow the kingdom of the beast instead, right? Over and again, there is an idea that the kingdom of darkness is at war with itself, that it can't do anything but bite and gnaw and destroy its own purposes. And the same thing now happens here. The beast will hate the prostitute. Why does the beast hate the prostitute? Well, we're given a fundamental reason. The fundamental reason is because God purposes that it should be so, right? We are reminded that the beast's actions here are still not of his own making. They are ultimately in the design of God. right? And John just kind of slips that one in and moves on, like, by the way, remember, everything here is still God's design, right? But proximately, right, more directly, we might point to the fact that elsewhere in Revelation and elsewhere in the New Testament, the man of lawlessness is described as one who will suffer no other gods, no other figures of worship but himself, right? He's got to be the one at the apex of the pyramid. And if the prostitute is this religious system that is not centered on him, there's perhaps a sense of jealousy here, right? That where the prostitute wants worship and adoration for her own purposes, the time comes when the beast will no longer suffer that and turns and destroys her. Now again, you can read that different ways, right? You can read that in the sense, if the prostitute is Jerusalem, that's Jerusalem's got a partial remaining Judaism, right? That's distorted, that's missed its Messiah, but that nonetheless wants to be a system of its own. Rome eventually will no longer tolerate that, right? Rome eventually comes in and tries to put an end to that. If you read that as something future, you can see this as some kind of future idolatrous worship, right? Some world system of religion that, again, at some point the beast says, no more worship of anything that's not me. But that is a recurring motif in this description. I have it here in 2 Thessalonians. You can find this idea even back in Daniel, that the man of lawlessness, or the one horn, sets himself above every god, above every rival to his authority, and demands that it all be focused on him. I think it's not unreasonable to see that connected with this act of destruction here. Finally, then, we have some interpretation of the beast. We are told that the beast has 7 heads, who are 7 mountains, and also 7 kings. We might instead interpret that as 7 kingdoms. Both readings are possible. He has 10 horns. The 10 horns are also 10 kings. Now, this again is familiar language. All the way back in Daniel 8, we saw a beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. And at the time, we were told that the 10 horns were 10 kingdoms. Something similar seems to be in play here. By the way, back then, 10 kings rose up, and 3 of them were cast down for one little horn to rise up in its place. Again, it's a real bad idea to be on Team Devil here, right? If the 10 kings are bad guys, the 10 kings still are not protected in all of this. We might even go back earlier in Daniel and hit the idea of the statue, right? With the head of gold and the chest of silver and the belly of bronze, all the way down to the last empire is the feet and the toes. And it specifically calls out feet and toes. I don't know how recently you've taken your shoes off, but if you count the little piggies, there's 10 of them, right? 10 is a recurring number here in describing something like heads or manifestations of the beast. How do we read that? I'll give you 3 ways. A premillennial reading here says we have 2 things in view. Remember, premillennialism is going to look at this primarily as future, right? Fulfillments yet to come. A premillennial reading is going to look at this and is going to say the 7 heads of the beast, the 7 kings, are indeed 7 kingdoms. They are manifestations of the beastly empire across time that have been enemies of Israel, enemies of the people of God throughout the ages. So if you go back in the Old Testament, who is, maybe the first empire that is broadly persecuting of Israel? It's Egypt, right? Egypt enslaves the children of Israel all the way back when they are literally the children of Israel, right? All the way back in Moses, they are in the Exodus, we are enslaving there. As you move forward, as you read through the accounts of the kings and the chronicles, you look at the empires that are persecuting the Jews. Assyria carries off the northern 10 tribes, right? Assyria carries off much of Israel into captivity. Then it's Babylon, then it's Persia, then it's Alexander the Great. That's 5 empires. 5 have fallen, right? There are 7 kings, 5 have fallen. One is, in John's day, the one who is again Rome, right? And then we're told one is not yet, one is still yet to come, one seventh empire. And then the beast himself is an eighth, but he belongs to the seven. And so there's some sense in which there is a final empire to come that metamorphoses into the beast as a whole. That the beast is manifested through all these empires across time, but there's a final empire, a seventh empire, that becomes the kingdom of the Antichrist. In that final kingdom, then, there are 10 kings of the earth. These are, in some sense, a revivified Rome or a final beastly kingdom. It was very popular for about 100 years to interpret, I say here in the 1990s, but you can find this as far back as the 1860s, to interpret these 10 kings as 10 European provinces that would join together in this final beastly empire. In the early 90s, it was very, very popular to read this as the European Union, right? Very popular. I'm seeing some folks nod at me there. Very popular to read this and kind of count how many countries joined the European Union as it worked its way up to 10. So we got 7, and then 8, and then 9, and then 10, and then 11, and then 12. And then it got less popular as an interpretation, right? We're told these are kings of the earth. I struggle a little, even if you're going to read it as premillennial, I struggle a little to see why we want to limit this to Europe, right? Like I'm not sure how much sense that makes in the context of the passage, yeah? A couple of concerns I have with this reading. One concern is that this list of empires is something you have to just kind of completely fabricate. You can pull a couple of these out of Daniel's list, right? You can look at Daniel and say, okay, Daniel identifies Babylon and Persia and Alexander and Rome, and there's 4. But adding Egypt and Assyria and a 7th and then an 8th that the 7th turns into, you're just kind of making stuff up at that point. That doesn't mean it's wrong, but it means we ought to hold that idea pretty lightly. Not every commentator, even those who agree with this general system, will agree on naming the exact same 7 empires across time, right? And where there's not enough evidence there for us to cleanly say these are the ones he's referencing, I'm a little bit hesitant on that, right? I'm a little bit cautious in saying that's what it's got to be. What about a postmillennial reading? Well, again, postmillennials are either going to say this is still judgment on Israel. We've talked about that already today. Or they're going to say, no, we've left behind judgment on Israel. We turn now to judgment on Rome. This is a promise of the fall of Rome. Rome has drunk itself, has become drunk on the blood of the Jews as it's been used by God to judge Israel. God now will judge Rome itself as the pagan empire now is overrun and destroyed in its time as well. This is a prophecy perhaps some 400 or 500 years early, but a prophecy that is fulfilled as Rome is finally judged and destroyed and the Roman Empire collapses on itself. In this view, the 7 kings are 7 emperors. And again, you can number this in different ways, but more or less, if you start counting Roman emperors from Julius Caesar, you get 5 emperors who have died. You get a 6th who is Nero, and then a 7th yet to come, right? We've talked about this before. A popular idea in the postmillennial reading is to say, okay, Nero is the emperor when John is writing. Nero dies. There is a myth, a theory that builds up around the death of Nero that promises Nero is going to rise from the dead and come back. And so many postmillennials read this and say, John is referencing this idea of Nero redivivus, this idea that Nero is going to come back from the dead and lead this final manifestation of the beast, right? That in some sense, this is the Neronic prophecy that's in view here. Now again, there's a couple of problems with that. One of the major problems being, again, our strongest evidence suggests Revelation is written 20 years after the death of Nero, when nobody believes Nero is coming back from the dead anymore, right? It was a lot more plausible that Tupac was going to roll back into town a while back than it is today. Today it would be fairly surprising, right? Same kind of thing applies with Nero. If John's writing in the late 90s, it is hard to have this interpretation. Further, if he's writing in the 70s, it kind of makes sense that, again, he's talking through how many emperors there are up to the judgment of Jerusalem. By the 90s, there have been more emperors than that, right? There's been, in some cases, a lot more emperors. There's a year that's called the Year of the Four Emperors. There are a lot of emperors in that year, right? And so the counting doesn't make sense. The numerology doesn't fit at that point. If you're going to hold this, you need John to be writing in the 70s. You have to just say, well, we're misinterpreting the rest of our evidence. In that reading, though, you might say that the 10 horns are something like 10 Roman provinces. Some argue that Nero put down 3 rebellions in 3 of his provinces, and that is the 3 horns uprooted before the little horn back in Daniel chapter 8, right? If that's the idea that's in view, you can see kind of a map here of Roman provinces. There are, again, more than 10 of them, but there's lots of ways of counting Roman provinces. You might say, well, there's 10 significant ones, or you might say 10 is just meant to represent all the Roman provinces. It's just a number of completeness. You might say that in some way, those are the 10 kings giving their authority to the beast. Finally, you have an amillennial reading. The amillennial reading says, all nations are the empire of the beast, right? The beast is the servant of the devil. The devil is the prince of this world. All nations are the empire of the beast to one degree or another. All nations invite you into their system rather than the system of God. And to one extent or another, they're going to try to pull you into, whether it's literal idolatry, whether it's materialism, whether it's whatever it might be, they're going to try to pull you away from focus on the kingdom of God. All of those then are ultimately doomed to destruction. And the woman is all such systems, every false religion, every false system that sets itself up as an alternative. The biggest, so I'm pointing out problems with each of these, right? I'll close with this. The biggest problem I have with the amillennial reading is I don't know what it means, and I couldn't find a commentator who gave me a real good sense of this, that the beast turns on the woman here. I don't know what that is in the amillennial reading to say the woman rides the beast and then the beast turns against her. That is not a thing that happens to all empires, right? That's just not every empire plays out that way. What is this event that's being described? What are we meant to take away from it beyond don't work for the devil, he's a really bad boss, right? Which, again, good godly principle, right? I'll amen to that, but is that all that's in view here? Okay, we see here at the end of chapter 17, Babylon's fall finally described to us. When we return to chapter 18, we will see her at last fully fallen. We will see that next week, and I will see all of you then. Thank you.